The night air above the Nile River was never completely silent. Even in the deepest hours before dawn, when most homes rested beneath the dark sky, there were always small sounds drifting across the water. The gentle movement of river reeds. The distant call of a bird waking too early. The soft splash of fish near the shore. The whisper of warm desert wind moving slowly over mud brick walls and sleeping courtyards. In ancient Egypt, long before the world became loud and fast, most people lived quiet and difficult lives shaped by routine, family, work, and the steady passage of the river. Tonight, as the stars hang above the dark water, we travel back into that distant world. We walk softly along narrow pathways of packed earth. We pass sleeping homes built from sun-dried mud bricks. We move beneath walls that still hold the warmth of the previous day's sun. Somewhere nearby, a dog lifts its head for a moment and then settles again. A small oil lamp burns inside a house. And inside that house, a child sleeps. That child does not yet know that growing older in ancient Egypt means learning many things. It means learning how to work, learning how to obey, learning how to carry weight, learning how to move quietly through a world where every person has a place, and every day follows a path already shaped by countless days before it. Growing up meant learning to become smaller inside a much larger world. As the night slowly moves toward morning, the household begins to stir. The home itself is simple. Its walls are thick and rough beneath the fingertips. The floor is packed earth, swept clean before sunset. A woven mat rests in one corner. Clay jars stand against the wall, holding water brought from the river the day before. The air inside the room is warm. A woman wakes first. She rises quietly, careful not to disturb the younger children sleeping beside her. She wraps herself in a simple linen garment and steps softly across the floor. Outside, the sky remains dark, but a faint gray line has begun to appear in the east. The day is already beginning. In ancient Egypt, work often started before sunrise. The woman kneels beside a grinding stone. She places grain into its hollow surface and begins the slow, familiar motion of turning and crushing. Stone scrapes against stone in a rhythm she has known since childhood. The sound is soft, steady, almost peaceful. Nearby, a small boy begins to wake. He opens his eyes slowly. For a few moments, he remains still, listening to the sound of grinding grain and the distant cries of birds near the riverbank. He is no longer considered very young. Soon, he will work beside his father. Soon, he will learn that each day belongs not to him, but to the needs of his family, his village, and the endless rhythm of the seasons. He sits up. The floor beneath him still holds a little coolness from the night. Outside, the first light of dawn spreads slowly across the land. The Nile River begins to shine. In the villages and towns that stretch along its banks, thousands of other children are waking too. Some sleep in crowded homes beside workshops. Some sleep in farming villages surrounded by fields. Others sleep near docks where fishermen prepare their boats before sunrise. Most will spend their lives doing the same work their parents did. A farmer's child becomes a farmer. A fisherman's child learns the river. A potter's child learns clay. A scribe's child learns writing. Growing older means accepting this quietly. There is little choice. The boy steps outside. The air feels cooler than it will only a few hours later. Already, people move along the dusty paths between houses. Sandals brush against earth. Clay water jars are lifted onto shoulders. Smoke begins rising from cooking fires. The village slowly awakens. He watches his father walking toward the storage shed. His father moves carefully. Years of labor have changed the way he walks. His shoulders lean slightly forward. His hands are thick and rough from tools, rope, mud, and stone. Even in the soft morning light, fatigue rests on his face. The boy has always known his father as someone who works. Work defines the rhythm of life. The river rises. The river falls. The crops grow. The crops fail. But work continues. His father notices him watching. There is no long conversation. There rarely is. Instead, the older man nods toward the fields beyond the village. The lesson begins. As they walk together, the sky brightens above them. The path beneath their feet is dry and uneven. Dust rises softly around their sandals. Along the roadside, other families move in the same direction. Some carry tools. Others carry baskets. A few lead donkeys loaded with supplies. No one rushes. There is too much work to do for anyone to waste energy moving quickly. The sun rises slowly over the horizon. Its light spreads across the Nile Valley. The river shines like polished bronze. Birds circle above the water. In the fields, farmers have already begun their labor. The boy watches everything. He watches how the older men hold their tools. He watches how they speak very little. He watches how they conserve their strength. He does not yet understand that one of the first lessons of growing older is learning to save energy whenever possible. The heat will come. The work will continue. And the body must endure. The morning passes quietly. They repair irrigation channels. They carry baskets of soil. They clear debris left behind by the river's previous flooding. The work is repetitive. The movements become rhythmic. Lift. Carry. Walk. Return. Lift again. The boy's arms begin to ache. His hands become sore. Sweat forms across his forehead. But he continues. No one asks if he is tired. Everyone is tired. This is simply life. As the sun climbs higher, the air changes. The coolness disappears. Heat settles across the land like a heavy blanket. The distant horizon begins to shimmer. Workers remove their sandals to shake out dust and grit. They wipe sweat from their faces with rough cloth. They pause only briefly before returning to their tasks. The boy glances toward the Nile. The water looks cool. Peaceful. Far away. He wonders if the fishermen are having an easier day. But the fishermen are working too. Farther downriver, boats rock gently against wooden docks. Nets are repaired. Oars push through dark water. Fish are sorted into baskets beneath the growing heat of the sun. Everyone works. The merchants work. The builders work. The servants work. The scribes bend over their records while sweat forms beneath their linen garments. Even children work. Especially children. Because growing up in ancient Egypt does not happen suddenly. It happens slowly. It happens through thousands of small lessons. Lessons learned beneath the morning sun. Lessons learned while carrying water. Lessons learned while grinding grain. Lessons learned while watching tired adults continue their work despite aching bodies and exhausted minds. And perhaps the first lesson of all is this: the world is very large. You are very small. And becoming an adult means learning exactly where your small place exists within that larger world. As the sun continues its slow journey across the sky, and the warm wind moves gently over the fields beside the Nile, the boy continues walking beside his father, taking one more step into the long and quiet work of growing up. The sun continued to climb. By the middle of the morning, the cool memories of dawn had already disappeared beneath the growing heat. The earth itself seemed to change. The dampness left by the river's flooding slowly dried. Dust settled over sandals, tools, and skin. The air became heavier, and every movement required a little more effort than before. The boy did not speak much. He had learned, even at his young age, that work was often done in silence. Not because silence was demanded, but because words required energy, and energy was valuable. His father worked beside him with the same steady rhythm he had shown since sunrise. Lift. Carry. Walk. Return. The movements repeated so many times that they almost stopped feeling like separate actions. They became a single motion that stretched across the entire morning. Around them, other families worked in the same way. An older man repaired a broken irrigation wall with careful hands. Two brothers carried baskets of wet earth from the riverbank. A woman moved slowly through a field, checking the young plants that had begun to grow after the flooding season. No one appeared hurried. No one appeared rested. The day simply unfolded around them. Far overhead, birds drifted through the pale sky. The Nile moved quietly beside the fields, as it had for countless generations. The boy occasionally looked toward the distant water. From where he stood, the river appeared calm and cool. Small boats drifted along its surface. Their sails hung softly in the warm air. He wondered what it would feel like to spend every day on the river. Perhaps fishermen became less tired than farmers. Perhaps boatmen escaped the heavy heat of the fields. But he had heard enough stories to know that every kind of work carried its own exhaustion. The fishermen woke before sunrise. The boatmen fought strong currents. The craftsmen sat for hours in crowded workshops. The builders carried stone beneath the burning sun. Every path led toward labor. As the morning continued, his father finally stopped working. Not for long. Only for a moment. He sat on a low stone beside the irrigation channel and removed one sandal. Dust had gathered between his toes. He rubbed his foot slowly, looking toward the river without saying anything. The boy sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. A warm wind drifted across the fields. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed softly. The sound carried through the air and disappeared. The boy studied his father's face. He noticed details he had never thought about before. The lines around his eyes. The scars on his hands. The way his shoulders remained slightly bent even while resting. His father had once been a child too. This thought felt strange. The boy had never imagined his father as anything other than tired. He tried to picture him running through village streets, swimming in the river, laughing with friends. But the image felt distant and unreal. In ancient Egypt, childhood did not last very long. A child learned quickly that there was little space between youth and responsibility. The father finally stood. Without speaking, he picked up his tool. The rest was over. They returned to work. The sun climbed higher. By midday, the heat settled over everything. The air shimmered above the fields. Even the birds grew quieter. Workers wrapped pieces of cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the sunlight. At last, the time came to eat. Families gathered in small patches of shade wherever they could find them. Beneath a tree. Beside a mud wall. Near a storage building. The boy sat with his father and several other workers. The meal was simple. Bread. A few onions. Some dried fish. A small amount of beer, weak and cloudy, carried in clay containers. No one complained about the food. Food was not expected to be exciting. It was expected to keep a person alive long enough to continue working. The boy ate slowly. The bread was coarse and dry. Small grains of sand sometimes found their way into the flour during grinding. Everyone accepted this. As he ate, he listened to the adults speaking quietly. They talked about water levels. They talked about crops. They talked about repairs that needed to be completed before the next flooding season. They talked about neighbors who had become ill. Illness was always nearby. A fever. An infected wound. A sickness carried by water. People lived close to work, close to animals, and close to exhaustion. Most families knew what it meant to lose someone. But grief, like labor, became part of the rhythm of life. The conversation faded. The workers rested. For a few precious moments, nobody moved. The boy leaned back against the warm earth. Above him, the sky stretched endlessly. The sunlight was almost too bright to look at. He closed his eyes. He listened. He heard insects moving through dry grass. He heard distant voices. He heard the soft wind coming from the direction of the river. He could have fallen asleep there. Many workers did. A short sleep during the hottest hours of the day was not laziness. It was survival. But the rest never lasted very long. Soon, people stood once more. Tools were lifted. Sandals returned to dusty feet. The afternoon began. This was another lesson of growing older. Rest was temporary. Comfort was temporary. Shade was temporary. Work remained. The boy rose beside his father. Together, they returned to the fields. The sun still burned above them. The Nile still flowed beside them. And somewhere, hidden inside the ordinary movements of the day, another small piece of childhood quietly disappeared. The afternoon light over the Nile Valley possessed a different kind of warmth. The brightness of midday slowly softened, though the heat remained. Shadows became longer. The color of the earth changed from pale gold to deeper shades of brown and red. Dust floated through the air in thin, almost invisible clouds, rising beneath the feet of workers who had already spent many hours beneath the sun. The boy felt the change in his body before he noticed it in the landscape. His arms felt heavier. His legs moved more slowly. The excitement he had once felt about helping the adults had faded into something quieter and more serious. He understood now why the older workers conserved their energy. He understood why they spoke so little. The day was long. And there was still much of it remaining. His father continued working with the same steady movements. From time to time, he paused only long enough to wipe sweat from his forehead or drink a small amount of water from a clay vessel. The boy watched him carefully. There were lessons everywhere. Not lessons spoken aloud. Not lessons written on papyrus. But lessons carried inside the movements of everyday life. How to hold a tool. How to carry a heavy basket without wasting strength. How to recognize when rain might come from distant lands far to the south. How to understand the moods of the river. How to continue working even when the body wished to rest. These were the lessons that transformed children into adults. As the afternoon slowly passed, a group of workers began repairing a damaged section of irrigation canal. The walls had partially collapsed during the previous flood season. Mud and reeds had gathered in the channel, slowing the movement of water. The repair work was slow. Everything in ancient Egypt was slow. Baskets of wet earth were carried from the riverbank. Stones were positioned carefully by hand. Mud was pressed into place with fingers, feet, and wooden tools polished smooth from years of use. The boy joined the work. At first, he tried to move quickly. He carried one basket, then another, then another. Soon, his breathing became heavy. His shoulders began to ache. His father noticed. Without speaking, he slowed his own movements. The boy understood. Speed was not important. Endurance was important. The day was not won by strength alone. It was won by patience. So he slowed his pace. He lifted carefully. He walked steadily. He returned quietly. And somehow, the work became easier. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly. The clouds, if there were any, drifted high and thin. Birds crossed the river in small groups. The Nile itself continued moving at its own ancient pace, unconcerned with the labor happening along its banks. For thousands of years, people had worked beside this water. For thousands of years, children had grown into adults beneath this same sky. The thought would have meant little to the boy. He knew only his village. He knew only his family. He knew only the daily rhythm of waking, working, eating, resting, and sleeping. That rhythm was the entire world. As the afternoon light softened further, the workers began returning toward the village. The journey back always felt longer. Their feet dragged slightly through the dust. Their shoulders sagged beneath the weight of tools and baskets. The excitement of morning had disappeared. Now there was only exhaustion. Yet there was comfort in this exhaustion. The work was finished. At least for today. The boy walked beside his father. They followed the familiar path between fields and irrigation canals. Small insects hovered over patches of standing water. The smell of wet earth mixed with the dry scent of dust and straw. Ahead of them, smoke rose from cooking fires. The village was preparing for evening. As they approached the houses, the sounds of daily life slowly returned. Children too young to work still played quietly in the narrow pathways. Women carried water jars from communal wells. A donkey brayed somewhere behind a wall. A potter sat outside his workshop, shaping clay while the last strong sunlight illuminated his hands. The boy noticed everything. The village seemed different now. Not because it had changed. Because he had changed. Only a little. But enough to notice. He noticed how tired everyone appeared. He noticed how slowly the adults walked. He noticed how carefully people protected whatever energy remained. Growing older meant seeing things that children often ignored. His family home looked exactly as it had that morning. The mud brick walls still held the day's heat. The doorway remained open to invite the evening air. Inside, the room was dim and cool compared to the outside world. His mother sat near a grinding stone. She had worked all day too. There had been grain to prepare, water to carry, clothing to wash, food to cook, children to watch. Her labor had happened inside the home rather than outside it, but it was labor nonetheless. She looked at the boy. She looked at his dusty face, his tired eyes, and his sore hands. She nodded. No words were needed. She understood. The evening meal was simple. Fresh bread, beans, a few vegetables, some fish brought from the river. The family sat together on woven mats. The room glowed softly with the light of a small oil lamp. Outside, darkness slowly spread across the village. The day's heat began to release itself back into the evening air. For a short time, work disappeared. People spoke quietly. Neighbors visited. Stories were shared. Children listened. These moments mattered. Not because they were exciting, but because they were rare. Most of life was labor. Rest was precious because it was brief. The boy listened as the adults talked. They spoke of river levels. They spoke of repairs needed on a neighbor's roof. They spoke of a man from another village who had become sick during the flood season. They spoke softly, as tired people often do. The oil lamp flickered. Shadows moved along the walls. Outside, the sounds of the village gradually faded. One by one, voices disappeared. Doors closed. Footsteps ended. The night returned. Later, after the meal had been finished and the lamp had nearly burned out, the boy stepped outside. The air felt cooler now. The stars stretched across the sky in numbers too great to count. The Nile reflected small pieces of their light. He could hear the river. Not loudly. Just enough to know it was there. Always moving. Always flowing. He sat quietly beside the house. His body ached. His hands hurt. His eyelids felt heavy. Tomorrow would be the same. The day after that would also be the same. And the day after that. This thought did not make him sad. It simply felt true. In ancient Egypt, growing up often meant accepting repetition. The same roads. The same fields. The same labor. The same sun rising and setting over the Nile. And somewhere within that endless repetition, childhood slowly faded away, not in a single moment, but through thousands of ordinary evenings beneath the stars. The wind moved softly through the village. A dog barked once in the distance. The river continued its patient journey through the darkness. And one more day of growing older quietly came to an end. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley. After the last voices faded and the final oil lamps were extinguished, a different world appeared. The heat of the day loosened its hold on the earth. A gentle breeze moved through the narrow paths between homes. Palm leaves rustled softly in the darkness. Somewhere near the riverbank, frogs called to one another in patient, repeating rhythms. The boy remained outside for a little while longer. The ground beneath him still held some of the day's warmth. Above him, the stars stretched across the sky with a clarity that would have been familiar to countless generations before him. The same stars had watched his father as a child. They had watched his grandfather. They had watched farmers, fishermen, builders, servants, and scribes for thousands of years. He did not think of history. He did not think of time. He simply felt tired. In ancient Egypt, exhaustion was one of the first experiences that truly connected children to adults. A child might play. A child might laugh. A child might dream. But sooner or later, every child learned what it felt like to carry the weight of an entire day inside the body. His eyelids grew heavy. At last, he stood and returned inside the house. The room was quiet. His younger siblings were already asleep, lying close together on woven mats. The small oil lamp had almost burned out. Its flame flickered weakly, casting soft shadows against the mud brick walls. His mother had already closed her eyes. His father sat quietly for a few moments longer. Perhaps he was resting. Perhaps he was thinking. Or perhaps he was simply enjoying the rare experience of doing nothing at all. The boy lay down. The woven mat beneath him was firm and familiar. A folded cloth supported his head. Through the doorway, he could still see a small piece of the night sky. He listened. The wind. The insects. The distant movement of water. The breathing of his family. Gradually, these sounds blended together. And sleep arrived. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not always comfortable. Homes were crowded. The air could remain warm long after sunset. Mosquitoes sometimes drifted through open doorways. The sounds of animals carried through the village. Yet people slept deeply. Their bodies demanded it. Each day required strength, and strength could only be restored through rest. The boy dreamed. Perhaps he dreamed of the river. Perhaps he dreamed of fields stretching toward the horizon. Perhaps he dreamed of nothing at all. Outside, the night continued its slow journey. The moon crossed the sky. The stars shifted overhead. Hours passed. And then, long before sunrise, the village began to wake once more. It always happened gradually. First came the sounds of animals. A goat shifting in its enclosure. A donkey stamping its feet. Birds stirring in the trees. Then came the sounds of people. A door opening. Footsteps on packed earth. The scrape of clay vessels being moved. The boy woke before he opened his eyes. He recognized the sounds immediately. Another day had begun. For a moment, he remained still. His muscles ached from yesterday's work. His hands still felt sore. He could have remained lying there forever. But he knew he would not. No one did. The house slowly filled with movement. His mother rose first, as she always did. The sound of grain being ground began once more. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Familiar. His father sat up. The older man's movements were careful. Years of labor had taught him that mornings required patience. The body needed time to remember how to move. The boy watched him. He noticed again how tired his father always seemed. Not unhappy. Not angry. Simply tired. There was a difference. In ancient Egypt, exhaustion was not unusual. It was expected. It was part of being alive. Soon, the first pale light appeared through the doorway. The sky shifted from black to dark blue. The stars began to disappear. Another day waited outside. The family ate a small morning meal. Bread. Water. A few dates. No one lingered. There was work to do. The boy stepped outside with his father. The air felt cool against his face. For a brief moment, before sunrise, the world seemed peaceful in a way that only existed for a short time each day. The village paths were quiet. Smoke rose slowly from cooking fires. The Nile reflected the faint light of dawn. Somewhere, a fisherman was already preparing his boat. Somewhere else, a baker was lighting an oven. In another home, another child was waking and preparing to work. The boy realized that he was no longer surprised by any of this. Yesterday had felt difficult. Today felt expected. Perhaps that was another lesson of growing older. The unusual eventually became ordinary. The difficult eventually became familiar. The body adapted. The mind adapted. Life continued. As they walked toward the fields, they passed a group of builders traveling toward a construction site farther north. The boy watched them carefully. They carried ropes, wooden tools, and baskets. Their shoulders were broad. Their hands were scarred. Some were old. Some were young. One of them looked only a few years older than the boy himself. The builders walked quietly. They knew what waited for them. Hours beneath the sun. Heavy stone. Dust. Sweat. Exhaustion. Yet they walked steadily. The boy wondered if he would one day become like them. In truth, he would become like someone. Everyone did. There were few paths through life, and each path demanded sacrifice. As they continued walking, the sun finally appeared above the horizon. Its light spread across the Nile Valley. The fields glowed gold. The river shimmered. The village behind them slowly disappeared beneath the brightness of morning. The day's labor began once again. But this morning felt different. Not because the work had changed. The work never changed. The fields remained the same. The tools remained the same. The sun remained the same. What had changed was something much smaller. The boy had begun to understand that growing older was not a single event. It was not a ceremony. It was not a celebration. It happened quietly. One morning, you woke up and discovered that you no longer expected the world to become easier. You simply expected yourself to become stronger. And beneath the warm Egyptian sun, beside the patient waters of the Nile, that lesson was learned again and again, by countless ordinary people whose names would never be written in stone. The days along the Nile did not announce themselves. They arrived quietly, one after another, like the gentle movement of the river itself. Morning followed night. Work followed morning. Evening followed work. And then darkness returned once again. For the boy, the passing of time was measured not by years, but by repetition. He measured it by the number of times he had walked the dusty path to the fields. He measured it by the number of baskets he had carried. He measured it by the number of evenings he had fallen asleep before the oil lamp had burned out. As the days continued, he began to notice changes that were almost too small to see. His hands became rougher. The skin on his feet grew thicker. His shoulders no longer ached after every task. The work itself remained difficult, but his body slowly learned how to live inside that difficulty. This was another quiet lesson of growing up. The body remembered. The body adapted. The body became what the world required it to become. One morning, not long after the flood waters had fully withdrawn from the fields, his father took him farther from the village than he had ever traveled before. They left while the sky was still dark. The stars remained overhead as they walked. The air was cool enough that their breath almost seemed visible. Around them, other workers moved in silence, carrying tools across their shoulders. No one spoke much. There was something peaceful about walking before sunrise. The world still belonged to the night. As they continued along the path, the village disappeared behind them. The familiar mud brick houses became distant shapes. The sounds of animals faded. Soon, there was only the sound of sandals pressing against earth and the soft movement of wind across the open land. The boy felt both excited and tired. He had never traveled this far before. Ahead of them lay a larger farming settlement, one that supplied grain to nearby towns and government storehouses. He had heard adults speak of such places. He had imagined them many times. Now, he would see one. The eastern sky slowly brightened. The stars faded. The outline of palm trees appeared in the distance. And then, as the sun began to rise, the settlement emerged from the morning haze. It was larger than his village. Much larger. Rows of mud brick buildings stretched along irrigation canals. Storage houses stood near the fields. Donkeys moved slowly beneath heavy loads. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires. People were already working. The boy stopped walking for a moment. He had never seen so many workers in one place. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. Not to comfort him. Not to encourage him. Simply to remind him to keep moving. So they continued. As they entered the settlement, the sounds of labor surrounded them. Wood striking stone. Voices calling quietly. Animals shifting beneath their burdens. The scrape of baskets across the ground. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke, sweat, and freshly baked bread. The boy realized something important. No matter how far he traveled, life remained the same. Different houses. Different people. Different roads. But the same work. The same exhaustion. The same rhythm. His father joined a group repairing grain storage buildings. The boy followed. The work required carrying mud, water, straw, and clay. Walls damaged by heat and weather needed constant repair. Nothing lasted forever. Not buildings. Not tools. Not bodies. Everything required care. The boy worked steadily. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The cool morning disappeared. Soon, sweat covered his face and arms. He looked around at the older workers. Some had gray hair. Some had bent backs. Some moved slowly because old injuries had never fully healed. Yet they continued. No one stopped. No one complained. Work was not something separate from life. Work was life. During the midday rest, the boy sat beneath a small patch of shade beside several laborers. One of the men had hands so scarred that the skin looked almost like old leather. Another had lost several teeth. A third man leaned carefully against the wall because his knees caused him pain. They spoke softly while they ate. They talked about harvests. They talked about weather. They talked about children. One of the men mentioned his oldest son. "He works harder than I did at his age," he said quietly. The others nodded. No one seemed surprised. The boy listened. He realized that the conversation could have taken place in his own village. Parents everywhere watched their children become workers. Children everywhere watched their parents grow old. The cycle continued. After the meal, the workers rested for a few moments. The boy leaned against the warm wall of the storage building. His eyes closed. He could hear flies buzzing nearby. He could hear someone breathing heavily. He could hear the distant sound of water moving through irrigation channels. For a brief moment, the entire world seemed half asleep. Then someone stood. Another worker followed. Soon everyone rose. The rest was over. The afternoon began. As the day continued, the boy noticed something else. No one celebrated becoming older. There was no single moment when a child suddenly became an adult. Instead, adulthood arrived through repetition. It arrived through sore muscles. Through early mornings. Through tired evenings. Through learning to continue even when the body wished to stop. Perhaps that was why so many adults appeared serious. Not because they lacked joy, but because they carried so many days inside them. As evening approached, the light softened. Long shadows stretched across the fields. The workers cleaned their tools. Some prepared to sleep at the settlement. Others, including the boy and his father, began the long journey home. The walk back felt longer than the journey there. Their feet dragged through the dust. The day's labor rested heavily in their bodies. The boy's shoulders ached. His hands hurt. He felt older than he had that morning. The sun slowly descended toward the western horizon. The Nile glowed beneath its fading light. Birds flew overhead, returning to their nests. The world itself seemed tired. After some time, the boy noticed that his father was walking more slowly than usual. Not dramatically. Only slightly. But enough to notice. For the first time, the boy wondered if his father had once walked faster. If he had once felt stronger. If growing older meant not only learning how to work, but also learning how to become tired in ways that never fully disappeared. The thought stayed with him. As darkness approached and the familiar outline of their village appeared in the distance, he understood another small truth. One day, he would walk like his father. One day, another child might walk beside him. And without anyone speaking about it, the same quiet lessons would be passed forward once again beneath the endless sky of ancient Egypt. The village looked different at sunset than it did at any other hour. As the boy and his father approached the familiar mud brick homes, the last light of the day rested softly on the walls. The heat that had filled the air since morning was finally beginning to fade. Long shadows stretched across the dusty path. Smoke from cooking fires rose slowly into the evening sky. The boy could smell bread baking before he could see his home. It was a comforting smell. A familiar smell. The smell of another day ending. His legs felt heavy. Each step required a little more effort than the one before. The basket he carried seemed heavier now than it had that morning. His shoulders ached from work, and his hands still held traces of dried mud. Beside him, his father walked quietly. They had spoken very little during the journey home. There was no need. After a long day of labor, silence often felt easier than conversation. As they entered the village, they passed neighbors returning from their own work. A fisherman carried a bundle of nets over his shoulder. A woman balanced a water jar on her head while leading a small child by the hand. An elderly man sat outside his home, watching the evening settle over the village. Everyone appeared tired. Not unhappy. Simply tired. The boy was beginning to understand the difference. Tiredness was not unusual. It was the condition of ordinary life. At home, his mother was already preparing the evening meal. The small courtyard beside the house glowed with the warm light of the setting sun. Grain had been ground. Dough had been shaped. Clay pots rested near the fire. She looked up as they entered. Again, there were few words. She noticed their exhaustion immediately. In ancient Egypt, people became skilled at recognizing fatigue in one another. It was visible in the way a person walked, the way they sat down, the way they breathed after carrying a heavy load. The boy set down his basket. For a moment, he simply stood still. The quiet felt good. The absence of movement felt good. He listened to the sounds around him. The crackling of fire. The distant voices of neighbors. The soft rustling of palm leaves. The occasional cry of a bird settling for the night. These sounds belonged to evening. They marked the transition between labor and rest. Soon, the family sat together to eat. The meal was simple, as most meals were. Bread. Beans. A few vegetables. Some dried fish. Water drawn from the river. The boy ate slowly. He noticed that his father also ate slowly. Not because the food required it, but because exhaustion made every action slower. The oil lamp flickered beside them. Its light cast gentle shadows on the walls. For a while, nobody spoke. The silence was comfortable. Outside, the sky gradually darkened. One by one, the stars appeared. After the meal, the boy's younger siblings began to grow sleepy. One leaned against their mother. Another rested their head on folded arms. The boy watched them. They still lived in a different world. A world where work was occasional. A world where tiredness disappeared after sleep. He wondered when that would change. He wondered when they would begin learning the same lessons he was learning. Perhaps sooner than they expected. In ancient Egypt, childhood often ended quietly. There was rarely an announcement. No ceremony. No special day. A child simply discovered, one morning, that adults expected more. And from that day forward, life became different. The boy stepped outside. The air was cooler now. Above him, the night sky stretched endlessly. The Nile reflected the moonlight in soft silver patterns. He walked toward the edge of the village. Not far. Just far enough to hear the river more clearly. The water moved with the same patient sound it had always made. He sat down. For the first time in many days, there was nothing he needed to carry. Nothing he needed to repair. Nothing he needed to finish. He could simply sit. This kind of stillness was rare. He listened carefully. A boat creaked somewhere in the darkness. Insects sang in the reeds. A gentle breeze moved across the water. The world felt enormous. And he felt very small. Yet this no longer frightened him. In fact, it felt strangely comforting. Perhaps everyone along the Nile felt this way. The fishermen. The farmers. The builders. The scribes. The merchants. All of them lived beside something much larger than themselves. The river. The seasons. The sky. Time itself. The boy looked upward. The stars seemed endless. His father often spoke of seasons. His grandfather had spoken of seasons. And someday, if he lived long enough, perhaps he too would speak of seasons to someone younger. The thought made him feel older than he had ever felt before. Not because he was becoming strong. Not because he was becoming wise. But because he was beginning to understand that life moved in circles. Children became workers. Workers became parents. Parents became old. And then new children began the journey again. The night grew deeper. A cool wind drifted across the riverbank. Back in the village, lamps were being extinguished one by one. The day was ending. At last, the boy stood. He returned slowly along the familiar path toward home. Inside, his family was already preparing to sleep. His father sat quietly near the doorway. For a moment, their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. The boy understood something now that he had not understood before. His father had never tried to teach him through speeches. He had taught him through mornings. Through labor. Through silence. Through endurance. Through simply continuing. The boy lay down on his woven mat. His body ached. His hands felt rough. His eyelids grew heavy almost immediately. Outside, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness. The stars continued their slow movement across the sky. The warm earth released the final heat of the day. And somewhere, in the quiet space between childhood and adulthood, the boy drifted gently into sleep, carrying with him the weight of another ordinary day in ancient Egypt. Before the sun returned to the Nile Valley, before the birds called from the reeds, and before the first cooking fires sent smoke into the pale morning sky, the boy woke once again. For a moment, he did not know why. The house was still dark. His family slept around him. The only sound was the soft breathing of those resting nearby and the distant whisper of wind moving against the walls of the village. He remained still. The woven mat beneath him felt warm. His body was heavy with sleep and the memory of yesterday's labor. His hands, resting against the earth floor, still felt rough from carrying baskets and shaping mud. Then he heard it. The river. Even from inside the house, he could hear its faint and constant movement. The Nile never truly slept. It moved through darkness and daylight with the same patient rhythm. It had flowed before his grandparents were born. It would continue flowing long after everyone he knew had disappeared. The thought was too large for him to fully understand. Still, he listened. Outside, the darkness slowly began to change. Not all at once. Very gradually. The black sky softened into deep blue. The stars nearest the horizon faded first. The world seemed to breathe. Soon, he heard another familiar sound. Stone against stone. His mother was already awake. The grinding of grain began once more. The sound was so ordinary that he rarely noticed it during the day. But in the quiet hours before dawn, it seemed almost musical. Slow. Steady. Unchanging. He sat up. Across the room, his father was also awake. The older man rubbed his eyes and stretched carefully, moving with the caution of someone whose body had spent many years carrying heavy loads. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Words were not necessary at this hour. Morning belonged to routine. The boy stood and stepped outside. The air was cool. Perhaps this was his favorite moment of the day. Not because he enjoyed waking early. No one enjoyed waking early. But because the world felt peaceful before labor began. The village remained mostly silent. The pathways between homes were empty except for a few early workers carrying water jars or tools. Palm trees stood motionless against the brightening sky. In the distance, a fisherman pushed his small boat into the river. The boy walked toward the edge of the village. The Nile lay before him. The water reflected the first light of dawn. Mist drifted above its surface. Birds stood quietly in the shallow water near the shore. For a moment, everything seemed still. He wondered if the river ever became tired. People became tired. Animals became tired. Even the earth seemed to become tired after months beneath the sun. But the river continued. Always moving. Always flowing. He crouched near the bank and touched the water. It felt cool against his fingers. Soon, the heat of the day would return. Soon, the dust would rise from the roads. Soon, the labor would begin. But not yet. For now, there was only the river. He remained there until he heard footsteps behind him. His father. The older man stood quietly beside him. Together, they looked across the water. Neither spoke. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Perhaps some moments were better left untouched by words. After a while, they returned to the village. The sun had begun to rise. Smoke drifted from cooking fires. Voices echoed softly between houses. The day was waking. At home, they ate a simple meal. Bread. A few dates. Water. The boy noticed that his father ate slowly. Not because there was plenty of time. There was never plenty of time. Rather, because he had learned over many years that rushing rarely made life easier. This, too, was a lesson. As they finished eating, another man arrived outside their home. He was older than the boy's father. His beard contained more gray than black. His shoulders were narrow. His face carried deep lines formed by years of sun and labor. The boy recognized him. He was a neighbor. A farmer. A man who had worked the same fields for longer than anyone could remember. The two men spoke quietly. There was work to be done near the river. More workers were needed. The boy prepared himself. Another day. Another task. Another lesson. The journey led them toward a section of the Nile where boats unloaded stone, wood, grain, and supplies from distant places. The boy had visited the river many times, but he had never spent an entire day working at the docks. As they approached, he heard the sounds long before he saw them. Voices, wood creaking, water splashing, rope pulling against stone. The riverbank was crowded. Boats of different sizes rested beside wooden piers. Workers carried baskets, sacks, and bundles across narrow walkways. Fishermen repaired torn nets. Merchants counted goods beneath simple shelters. The boy stopped and looked around. There were so many people, and every one of them was working. He watched a young man carrying a sack of grain. The man was perhaps only a few years older than himself. Yet his shoulders were already broad from labor. His hands were thick and scarred. His face looked tired. The boy watched him disappear into the crowd. Perhaps that was another part of growing older. One day, you stopped noticing that adults were different from children. Instead, you began noticing how quickly children became adults. The work at the docks was difficult. Heavy ropes had to be pulled. Cargo had to be unloaded. Crates had to be carried across uneven ground. The sun climbed steadily higher. The smell of river water mixed with mud, sweat, fish, and damp wood. The boy worked beside his father. At first, he struggled. The loads felt heavier than those carried in the fields. The ground beneath his feet shifted. His arms trembled with effort. But he continued. Because everyone else continued. An old fisherman with bent shoulders continued. A laborer with a scar across his face continued. A young worker, barely older than the boy himself, continued. The river moved. The sun climbed. The work continued. By midday, exhaustion settled into his body. Not the sharp exhaustion of pain, but the deep exhaustion of repetition. The kind that moved slowly into the muscles and remained there. During the midday rest, he sat beneath the shadow of a storage building. Around him, workers ate quietly. Some slept. Others stared at the river. No one wasted energy. The boy looked at their faces. Young faces. Old faces. Faces marked by heat, dust, and labor. And for the first time, he understood something that had always been in front of him. Growing up did not mean becoming important. It did not mean becoming powerful. For most people, growing up meant learning how to carry ordinary burdens. It meant learning how to wake before sunrise. How to work while tired. How to endure heat. How to accept repetition. How to continue. The river flowed quietly beside them. The afternoon waited ahead. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, surrounded by thousands of ordinary lives, the boy continued learning how to become small within a very large world. The afternoon settled over the river like a heavy blanket. The brief rest beneath the storage building had ended, and the workers returned to their tasks without complaint. The shade disappeared behind them. The sun stood high above the Nile, filling the air with a heat that seemed to slow everything except the river itself. The boy stood carefully. His legs felt stiff. His shoulders ached. For a moment, he wished he could remain where he was, sitting against the cool mud brick wall and listening to the water move past the docks. But wishing was not part of the rhythm of work. So he stood. And he followed the others. The afternoon labor was different from the morning's labor. In the morning, the body still held some strength from sleep. By afternoon, that strength had faded. Every basket felt heavier. Every step required more effort. Even lifting one's arms seemed to require thought. The boy carried bundles of rope from one end of the dock to another. He helped move jars of grain into storage buildings. He swept loose straw and debris from the walkways. None of the tasks were difficult by themselves. The difficulty came from doing them for hours. The difficulty came from the sun. The difficulty came from knowing that tomorrow would be much the same. He began to understand why older workers moved so carefully. They were not slow because they were weak. They were slow because they had learned how to survive. Nearby, a fisherman sat repairing a torn net. The man worked with remarkable patience. His fingers moved steadily through the strands of rope. He did not hurry. He did not pause. He simply continued. The boy watched him for a moment. The fisherman noticed. He smiled slightly. Not a broad smile. Just enough to show that he understood. Everything takes time, the man said quietly. Then he returned to his work. The boy thought about those words for the rest of the afternoon. Everything takes time. Learning to work took time. Learning to endure took time. Growing older took time. Even becoming tired seemed to take time. The sun moved slowly across the sky. Its light softened. The shadows of boats stretched farther across the water. Birds began returning to the riverbanks. The workers noticed these changes without speaking of them. Their bodies had learned to measure time through light, heat, and shadow. No one needed to ask what hour it was. The earth itself provided the answer. At last, the day's labor at the docks ended. Tools were gathered. Ropes were tied. Cargo was secured for the night. The workers washed their hands and faces in the river where they could. The cool water felt almost shocking after the heat of the day. The boy knelt beside the Nile. He dipped both hands into the water. For a few moments, he simply watched the ripples spread outward. The river looked peaceful. It always looked peaceful. Even though countless people depended on it. Even though entire lives rose and fell with its flooding. Perhaps that was another lesson. The most important things often appeared calm. His father called to him softly. It was time to return home. The journey back felt longer than ever. The boy's feet dragged through the dust. The road seemed endless. The evening air had cooled slightly, but the day's heat still rested inside his body. Around him, other workers traveled home as well. Some spoke quietly. Others walked in silence. An older laborer carried his tools across his shoulders and stared straight ahead, saving what little energy remained. The boy noticed the man's hands. They were rougher than his father's. He wondered how many years of work had shaped them. 10 years. 20 years. Perhaps more. The thought made him feel both small and old at the same time. As they walked, they passed fields where farmers were finishing their final tasks before darkness. A woman gathered tools beside an irrigation canal. A boy younger than himself carried a basket of reeds. An old man sat on a stone wall, resting before the final walk home. Everywhere he looked, people were ending their day. The entire world seemed tired. The sun slowly descended. Its light became golden. The Nile shimmered. Palm trees cast long shadows over the earth. The beauty of the evening did not erase the exhaustion of the day. But somehow, it made the exhaustion feel softer. When the village finally appeared in the distance, the boy felt relief. Not excitement. Not joy. Just relief. Home meant rest. Even if the rest would not last very long. As they entered the village, familiar sounds greeted them. A child crying. A donkey shifting its weight. The sound of grain being ground. The smell of bread baking. These ordinary things felt comforting. The world was large. The river was large. The labor was endless. But home remained home. Inside the house, his mother was preparing the evening meal. The oil lamp had already been lit. Its soft flame filled the room with a warm glow. The boy sat down slowly. His entire body felt heavy. He looked at his hands. They no longer looked like the hands of a child. Not entirely. Small cuts marked his fingers. Dust remained beneath his nails. The skin on his palms had become harder. He wondered when this had happened. He could not remember. Perhaps that was how growing up always happened. Not all at once. Not in a single day. But gradually. Quietly. Almost invisibly. The family ate together. No one spoke much. They did not need to. They all understood what the day had been. The oil lamp flickered. Outside, the stars appeared one by one. The village became quiet. The heat slowly escaped into the night. Later, after the meal had ended, the boy lay on his woven mat and listened once more to the distant sound of the Nile. His body ached. His eyes felt heavy. Tomorrow would come soon. The river would continue. The sun would rise. The work would begin again. And somewhere within that endless cycle of mornings and evenings, labor and rest, childhood and adulthood, he would continue learning the long and quiet art of becoming small in the ancient world. The night passed as it always did. Slowly. Quietly. The sounds of the village faded into darkness, and the darkness itself seemed to drift over the Nile Valley like a soft blanket. The stars moved across the sky. The river continued its patient journey northward. A cool breeze occasionally found its way through the narrow streets and into the homes built from mud and straw. The boy slept deeply. Not because his bed was comfortable. Not because the night was especially peaceful. He slept because his body had no choice. Work demanded sleep just as surely as morning demanded work. When he opened his eyes again, the world was still dark. For a few moments, he remained where he was. He listened. The familiar sounds had already begun. The soft scraping of grain being ground. The rustle of cloth. The quiet movements of adults preparing for another day. He no longer felt surprised by these sounds. In fact, he found them comforting. A life filled with routine could become a kind of shelter. The boy sat up slowly. His muscles complained. His shoulders remained sore from the previous day's labor at the river docks. His hands still felt stiff. He rubbed them together and looked toward the doorway. Outside, the sky had begun its slow transformation from black to blue. Another day was arriving. He wondered how many mornings his father had experienced. Thousands, perhaps. How many times had his father risen before dawn? How many times had he walked the same roads? How many times had he looked at the same river? The thought made his father seem both familiar and mysterious. When the boy was younger, he had imagined adults as people who understood everything. Now he was beginning to suspect something else. Perhaps adults simply became accustomed to not understanding. Perhaps they continued because continuing was the only choice. He stood and stepped outside. The air was cool and still. The village remained mostly silent. In the east, a pale light spread slowly across the horizon. A few stars remained visible overhead. The Nile reflected the changing colors of the sky. The boy took a deep breath. He could smell water. He could smell dust. He could smell smoke from the first cooking fires. These scents belonged to morning. As he stood there, he noticed another figure walking through the village. An older woman. She carried 2 clay jars balanced carefully against her body. Her pace was slow but steady. The boy recognized her. She lived near the edge of the village. He realized that he had always known her as old. He had never imagined her as young. Yet once, she must have been. Once, she had been a child waking before dawn. Once, she had learned how to carry water. Once, she had watched adults and wondered when she would become one. The thought stayed with him. As people grew older, they seemed to become fixed in the minds of children. Parents had always been parents. Old people had always been old. But now he understood that everyone had traveled the same road. Everyone had once been small. Back inside the house, the morning meal was prepared. Bread, water, a few figs. The family ate quietly. The younger children still looked sleepy. The boy studied them. Their hands remained soft. Their faces remained free from the tired expressions he saw on adults. He wondered how long that would last. Not many years. Perhaps only a few. His father finished eating and stood. Today, they would not travel to the river. There was work inside the village itself. A neighbor's roof had been damaged. The walls of another house needed repair. Labor existed everywhere. The village itself required constant care. The boy followed his father into the morning light. The sun had not yet fully risen. The streets remained cool. Neighbors greeted one another quietly. A dog slept beside a doorway. A donkey chewed slowly beside a storage building. The world seemed peaceful. But beneath that peace lay work waiting to be done. They arrived at the first house shortly after sunrise. Its roof had suffered damage during a recent windstorm. Bundles of reeds needed replacement. Mud plaster needed repair. The owner of the house, a man older than the boy's father, greeted them with gratitude. The boy noticed something immediately. This man's hands shook slightly. His movements were careful. He climbed the ladder slowly. Age had changed him. The boy watched his father help the older man. Neither spoke very much. They simply worked together. There was something comforting about this. In the village, people depended on one another. No one could repair every roof. No one could harvest every field. No one could survive entirely alone. The boy climbed onto the roof. The morning sun warmed the dried reeds beneath his feet. From above, he could see the entire village. Mud brick homes. Narrow pathways. Cooking fires. Children running. Workers walking toward the fields. And beyond all of it, the Nile. Always the Nile. The river seemed to hold everything together. The people. The crops. The roads. The routines. The lives. He worked carefully. Passing bundles. Mixing mud. Pressing repairs into place. The labor was not as heavy as carrying cargo at the docks. But it required patience. Another lesson. Perhaps adulthood was simply a collection of lessons about patience. Patience with work. Patience with heat. Patience with exhaustion. Patience with life itself. As the morning passed, the sun climbed higher. The air grew warmer. Sweat gathered on everyone's faces. Yet no one hurried. The roof would be repaired when it was repaired. The day would end when it ended. Time moved differently here. Not according to clocks. Not according to schedules written down by scribes. Time moved according to sunlight, according to seasons, according to the body. By midday, the repairs were finished. The workers sat together in the shade of the house. They shared bread and water. The older man who owned the house looked at the boy. "You work well," he said softly. The boy lowered his eyes. He did not know how to respond. No one had said that to him before. His father did not speak. But he nodded once. The boy felt something warm inside his chest. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. Perhaps it was the feeling of becoming useful. Perhaps that was another part of growing older. Not becoming important. Not becoming powerful. Simply becoming someone others could depend on. The thought remained with him as the afternoon sun spread across the village and another ordinary day in ancient Egypt continued its slow and patient journey toward evening. The afternoon heat settled over the village with a familiar weight. The brief meal in the shade had offered some comfort, but not enough to restore what the morning had taken away. The boy could feel the tiredness returning to his arms and shoulders as he stood beside his father once more. Around them, the village moved slowly. The brightest hours of the day always changed the pace of life. People walked more carefully. Conversations became shorter. Even the animals sought shade wherever they could find it. The old man whose roof they had repaired thanked them again. His voice was quiet. His hands trembled slightly as he offered them water. The boy noticed that his father accepted the gesture with respect. Not because the water was special, but because in a world shaped by labor and exhaustion, kindness itself was valuable. As they walked away, the boy looked back. The old man had already sat down beneath the shadow of his house. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked less like an elder and more like a worker who had simply become very tired after many years. The boy wondered if growing old felt like carrying every previous day inside your body. The thought stayed with him. Their next task lay near the edge of the village, where a family kept a small garden beside their home. A section of the wall surrounding the garden had collapsed after several days of strong wind. It was not important work. No official would record it. No scribe would write about it. No monument would ever remember it. Yet the wall still needed to be repaired. The boy was beginning to understand that most of life consisted of tasks that nobody would remember. A basket needed carrying. A roof needed fixing. A field needed planting. A meal needed cooking. A child needed teaching. The world continued because ordinary people continued. They worked quietly through the afternoon. The sun remained high. Dust clung to their skin. The smell of warm earth filled the air. Nearby, a woman watered plants using small clay containers. She moved slowly, carefully pouring each measure of water at the roots. Nothing was wasted. Not water. Not food. Not energy. The boy helped carry stones to rebuild the wall. At first, he counted the trips. 5. 10. 15. Then he stopped counting. After enough repetition, numbers lost their meaning. Only the movement remained. Lift. Walk. Set down. Turn around. Lift again. As he worked, he noticed a group of younger children playing in the shade of a palm tree. They were chasing one another through the dust. Their laughter carried across the warm afternoon air. The boy stopped for only a moment. He remembered doing the same thing. Not long ago. Or perhaps it had been long ago. It was difficult to tell. Time felt strange now. Days seemed long. Years seemed short. He watched the children run. Their feet kicked up dust. Their voices echoed against the mud brick walls. For a brief moment, he felt something he could not quite name. Not sadness. Not happiness. Perhaps it was simply the realization that childhood never announced when it was leaving. One day, you were playing. Then one day, you were working. And somehow, without noticing exactly when it happened, the world expected different things from you. His father called to him. The moment passed. He returned to carrying stones. The afternoon stretched on. The air became thicker. The sunlight softened almost imperceptibly. Shadows grew longer. Eventually, the wall stood once again. Not perfectly. Nothing in the village was perfect. But it was strong enough. And often, strong enough was all that mattered. The family thanked them. A small piece of bread was offered. His father accepted it. Again, not because they needed it, but because accepting gratitude was also part of community. As they walked home, the village seemed quieter than usual. Many people had already returned from the fields. Others sat outside their homes, resting before the evening meal. The boy noticed how everyone rested differently. Some closed their eyes. Some stared at the ground. Some watched the sky. After a long day, even deciding where to look required effort. The sun was beginning to descend. Its light turned the walls of the village golden. The Nile shimmered in the distance. Birds crossed the sky in small groups, returning to places where they would spend the night. The entire world seemed to be slowing down. As they approached home, the boy walked beside his father in silence. Then, unexpectedly, his father spoke. "When I was your age," he said quietly, "I thought adults were never tired." The boy looked at him. It was one of the longest sentences his father had spoken in many days. His father smiled slightly. "I was wrong." For a few moments, neither spoke. The boy thought about those words. Adults were tired. They had always been tired. He simply had not noticed. As a child, he had believed that adults belonged to a different world. A stronger world. A world untouched by fear, exhaustion, or uncertainty. Now he understood. Adults simply carried those things more quietly. They rose before dawn despite their tiredness. They worked despite their pain. They cared for others despite their exhaustion. Perhaps that was what adulthood really was. Not becoming stronger, but learning how to continue while feeling weak. They reached home just as the sun touched the horizon. The sky glowed with soft shades of gold and red. Smoke drifted from cooking fires. The smell of baking bread filled the air. The boy's mother sat outside preparing the evening meal. She looked tired too. He had never really noticed before. Not fully. The lines around her eyes. The way she stretched her back after standing. The way she paused before lifting heavy pots. Everyone was carrying something. Some carried baskets. Some carried water. Some carried entire families. The evening meal was quiet. The oil lamp flickered. The younger children fell asleep before the meal had fully ended. Outside, darkness slowly covered the village. Later, as the boy lay on his woven mat, listening to the distant sound of the Nile moving through the night, he thought about his father's words. Adults were tired. They had always been tired. And perhaps growing up meant discovering that everyone around you had been carrying invisible weight all along. The river flowed. The stars moved overhead. The village slept. And somewhere, in the silence between one ordinary day and the next, the boy continued the slow and ancient process of learning how to become small in a very large world. The night air remained cool for only a little while. Before long, the warmth stored inside the earth during the day slowly returned. The mud brick walls of the house released their heat into the darkness. The wind softened. The sounds of the village faded until only the river remained. The boy slept. He dreamed of walking. Not toward anything. Not away from anything. Simply walking. Along the river. Through the fields. Beneath the sun. When he opened his eyes, he felt as though he had only just closed them. The house was dark. For a moment, he wondered if the night had somehow stopped. Then he heard it. The familiar sound. Stone against stone. His mother was grinding grain again. Another day had arrived. He sat up slowly. His body felt heavier than it had a few days before. Not because he had become weaker. Rather, because he was beginning to understand what it meant to wake with yesterday still inside him. His shoulders remembered. His hands remembered. Even his feet remembered. Across the room, his father was awake. The older man sat quietly for a few moments before standing. He rubbed one shoulder carefully, then stretched his back. The boy noticed. His father noticed that he had noticed. For a brief moment, they looked at one another. Then both looked away. Some things did not require discussion. Outside, the sky was beginning to change. The stars remained overhead, but they seemed less bright than before. A pale gray light spread across the eastern horizon. The village was waking. A door opened nearby. A donkey shifted its weight. Someone coughed. The smell of smoke drifted through the cool air. The boy stepped outside. He breathed deeply. Morning was always his favorite time. Not because he enjoyed the coming work. No one enjoyed that. But because the world felt gentle before sunrise. The Nile reflected the fading stars. Palm trees stood silently. The earth itself seemed to be resting for a few final moments before the day began. He walked toward the river. Not far. Just enough to hear the water more clearly. As he approached, he noticed someone else standing near the bank. An old fisherman. The boy recognized him immediately. He had seen the man many times. He lived alone in a small house near the edge of the village. He repaired nets. He sold fish. He rarely spoke. The old man stood with his hands behind his back, looking out over the water. The boy stopped a short distance away. He did not want to disturb him. After a few moments, the old fisherman spoke. The river looks different every morning. His voice was soft. The boy looked at the water. It appeared the same as always. Quiet. Dark. Patient. The fisherman smiled slightly. It takes many years to notice the differences. Then he fell silent again. The boy did not know how to respond. So he simply stood beside him. Together, they watched the sun begin to rise. The first light spread slowly across the water. The river changed color. Dark blue became silver. Silver became gold. Birds lifted from the reeds. The day began. The old fisherman nodded once. Then he walked away. The boy remained by the river for a little longer. He thought about what the man had said. Perhaps growing older meant learning to notice small things. The way the river changed. The way people became tired. The way children slowly became adults. Eventually, he returned home. The morning meal was waiting. Bread. Water. a few pieces of dried fruit. The younger children still looked sleepy. One rubbed their eyes. Another yawned. The boy watched them carefully. They still belonged to childhood. He wondered how much longer they would remain there. After eating, he followed his father toward the fields. The journey felt familiar. Dust beneath their sandals. The smell of earth. The sound of distant voices. The sun rising behind them. They passed farmers carrying tools. Women carrying water jars. Children leading goats. Every person seemed to be moving toward some responsibility. No one wandered. No one drifted. Everyone belonged somewhere. As they reached the fields, the boy saw that the work had already begun. The irrigation channels required cleaning. The recent flow of water had carried mud, reeds, and debris into the narrow passages. If the channels became blocked, the crops would suffer. So the channels had to be cleared. The work itself was simple. Bend. Lift. Carry. Repeat. The boy stepped into the shallow water. Mud pressed between his toes. The morning air remained cool, but not for long. He worked beside his father. Nearby, other workers did the same. No one complained. Complaints required energy. Energy was better saved for labor. As the sun climbed higher, the fields changed. The coolness vanished. The air became thick. Sweat gathered beneath linen clothing. The mud dried on their skin. The boy's back began to ache. He straightened himself for a moment and looked around. Everywhere, people continued. An older farmer with gray hair continued. A young worker scarcely older than himself continued. A woman carrying baskets continued. Everyone continued. He remembered his father's words. Adults were tired. They had always been tired. Now he understood something more. Adults were tired because they had never stopped. One day followed another. One season followed another. One responsibility followed another. And somehow, they continued. The boy bent down and lifted another basket of mud. The sun warmed his face. The river flowed nearby. Birds crossed the sky. Nothing about the day seemed important. No king would hear of it. No monument would remember it. No scribe would record it. And yet, to the people living it, this ordinary day was everything. As the morning slowly moved toward midday, the boy felt another small piece of childhood slip quietly away, carried downstream with the endless waters of the Nile. The sun continued its slow climb across the sky. By midday, the coolness of morning had become a distant memory. The air above the fields shimmered. The earth itself seemed to radiate heat. Even the birds that had filled the morning with their calls had grown quieter. The boy stood in the irrigation channel with mud covering his feet and lower legs. His arms felt heavy. His back ached. When he lifted another basket of wet earth, he could feel the strain in muscles he had not known existed only a few months before. Yet he continued. Everyone continued. The older farmer beside him continued. His father continued. The woman carrying reeds continued. No one expected the day to become easier. They expected themselves to endure. At last, someone called for a rest. Not because the work was finished. The work was never truly finished. But because the heat had become too great to ignore. The workers climbed out of the irrigation channels and sought whatever shade they could find. Some sat beneath trees. Others rested against mud walls or beneath simple shelters made from reeds. The boy followed his father to a patch of shade beside a storage shed. The shade itself felt like a gift. He sat down carefully. For a few moments, he simply breathed. His father handed him a small clay cup of water. The boy drank slowly. The water was warm. Still, it felt refreshing. Nearby, the other workers sat in silence. One man closed his eyes immediately. Another rubbed his knees with both hands. A woman removed her sandals and shook dust from them. No one wasted movement. The boy leaned against the wall of the shed. Above him, the roof creaked softly in the heat. He listened. The distant sound of the river. The buzzing of insects. The slow breathing of tired workers. The entire world seemed to have become sleepy. His eyelids felt heavy. For a moment, he imagined what it would be like to spend the entire day resting in the shade. To wake when he wished. To walk where he wished. To do nothing. But the thought felt strange. Almost impossible. In his world, everyone worked. Even those who appeared to rest had worked before, or would work again. The old fisherman repaired his nets. His mother prepared food and carried water. The scribes bent over their writing. The merchants traveled long roads. The builders carried stone. Everyone belonged to labor. The boy closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Just to rest them. He listened to the voices around him. Two older men were speaking quietly. They spoke of the river. They spoke of the flooding season. Then one of them laughed softly. I remember when I could work from sunrise to sunset and still have strength left. The other man nodded. I remember when my back did not hurt. They both laughed again. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. The boy opened his eyes. He looked at the two men. He had always known them as old. He had never imagined them as young. Yet once they had been boys too. Once they had stood in the fields beneath the sun and believed that their strength would last forever. The thought unsettled him. Not because it frightened him, but because it made growing older feel real. He looked at his father. His father sat with his back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slowly. The boy noticed the lines on his face. He noticed the scars on his hands. He noticed the way one shoulder rested slightly lower than the other. These things had always been there. He was only now learning to see them. After a time, the rest ended. No one announced it. One person stood. Then another. Then everyone. That was often how things happened. The work itself decided when it was time to continue. The boy rose. His legs felt stiff. The afternoon waited. The heat remained. The irrigation channels still needed clearing. So he returned to work. The sun stood above them. The mud clung to their skin. The air shimmered. The day seemed endless. Yet slowly, almost without noticing, the light began to change. The shadows grew longer. The heat softened. The birds returned. The boy realized that he had stopped thinking about when the work would end. He had simply accepted that it would continue until it no longer did. Perhaps that was another lesson. Growing older meant learning to stop asking how much longer. It meant understanding that some things could only be endured one moment at a time. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the workers cleaned their tools. The irrigation channels flowed once more. Water moved quietly through them, carrying life toward the fields. The boy stood and watched it. The water did not hurry. It did not complain. It simply moved forward. His father stood beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then his father said something unexpected. When I was young, I wanted to leave this village. The boy turned. His father rarely spoke of himself. Where did you want to go? The boy asked quietly. His father looked toward the Nile. Everywhere. The answer surprised him. Why didn't you go? His father was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. Not sadly. Just softly. I grew older. The boy thought about this as they began walking home. The road was familiar. The dust was familiar. The setting sun was familiar. But his father's words remained with him. Perhaps everyone, when they were young, imagined a larger world. And perhaps growing older did not mean that the world became smaller. Perhaps it meant understanding which small part of the world belonged to you. The village appeared ahead of them. Smoke rose into the evening sky. The smell of bread drifted through the air. Children's voices echoed faintly between the houses. Home. The boy suddenly realized that he had spent the entire day thinking about becoming older. Yet as he walked through the familiar streets beside his father, listening to the sound of sandals against dust and watching the evening light settle over the mud brick walls, he felt something unexpected. He did not feel old. He felt small. And for the first time, he understood that perhaps everyone in ancient Egypt, from the youngest child to the oldest worker, carried that same feeling quietly inside them. The Nile flowed. The sun set. The village prepared for night. And another ordinary day slipped gently into memory. The evening settled over the village as softly as dust settling onto a road. The sun disappeared beyond the western horizon, leaving behind a sky painted with pale gold, faded orange, and deepening blue. The heat of the day slowly loosened its grip on the earth. Shadows stretched across the narrow paths between homes. The air carried the smells of cooking fires, warm bread, and the distant river. The boy walked beside his father in silence. After a long day, silence felt natural. There were no stories to tell. No great events to discuss. The day had been ordinary. And ordinary days were what life was made of. As they entered the village, they passed people doing what they always did at this hour. Women prepared evening meals. Children who were still young enough to play chased one another through the dust. Older workers sat outside their homes, allowing their bodies to rest before darkness arrived completely. The boy noticed an old woman sitting alone beside her doorway. She was weaving a basket. Even in the fading light, her hands continued moving. Slowly. Carefully. Patiently. He wondered how many baskets she had woven during her life. Hundreds. Perhaps thousands. He wondered if she remembered the first one. He wondered if she had ever imagined, as a child, that she would spend so many evenings sitting beneath the same sky, repeating the same movements. The thought did not seem sad. It simply seemed true. At home, the evening meal was already being prepared. The oil lamp had been lit. Its flame danced softly against the mud brick walls. His mother sat near the fire, turning bread carefully. She looked tired. The boy had noticed this more often recently. Not because she had become more tired. Because he had become better at seeing it. He sat down quietly. The younger children were speaking softly to one another. They laughed about something small. Something that would be forgotten by tomorrow. The sound filled the room. The boy listened. He remembered when laughter had felt easier. Not because life had changed, but because he had changed. The family ate together. Bread. Beans. A few vegetables. A little fish. The meal was simple. The meals were always simple. Yet after a day of labor, simplicity itself became comforting. His father ate slowly. His mother ate slowly. Everyone moved slowly. The day still rested inside their bodies. After the meal, the younger children fell asleep quickly. One leaned against the wall. Another curled up beside their mother. The oil lamp flickered. Outside, the village grew quieter. The boy stepped outside once more. He found himself doing this more often. Perhaps because the night belonged to thinking. During the day, there was no time. There was only work. But at night, beneath the stars, thoughts had room to grow. He walked toward the river. Not because he had a reason. Only because the river was always there. The path felt familiar beneath his feet. The air had cooled. A breeze moved gently through the reeds. Above him, the stars had returned. The same stars. Always the same stars. He reached the bank of the Nile. The water reflected the moonlight. Small ripples spread across its surface. Somewhere in the darkness, a fish disturbed the water. Then silence returned. He sat down. The earth beneath him still held some warmth from the day. He listened to the river. When he was younger, he had thought of the Nile as something enormous. Something powerful. Something almost beyond understanding. Now, he thought of it differently. The river was not only powerful. It was patient. It continued. Every day. Every season. Every year. Perhaps that was why people built their lives beside it. Because it taught them how to continue. The boy looked upward. The stars seemed endless. He thought about his father's words from earlier. When I was young, I wanted to leave this village. The idea still surprised him. He had never imagined his father wanting anything different. He had never imagined his father dreaming. But perhaps everyone dreamed when they were young. Perhaps everyone imagined becoming someone else. Going somewhere else. Living some other life. And then, slowly, quietly, life happened. A family. A field. A house. A responsibility. And one day, the dream became a memory. He wondered what dreams he himself might forget. The thought did not frighten him. It simply made him feel older. Nearby, he heard footsteps. He turned. It was the old fisherman. The same man he had spoken to beside the river that morning. The fisherman sat down nearby. For a while, neither of them spoke. The river moved. The stars shone. The night air cooled. At last, the old man spoke. When I was your age, he said softly, I thought becoming a man meant becoming large. The boy listened. The fisherman smiled. I was wrong. The boy waited. The old man looked out at the river. Growing older teaches you how small you really are. The words drifted into the night. Neither of them spoke after that. There was nothing else to say. After some time, the old fisherman stood. He nodded once. Then he disappeared into the darkness. The boy remained beside the river. He thought about what the fisherman had said. Growing older teaches you how small you really are. Perhaps that was true. As a child, the world seemed small because you believed you understood it. As you grew older, the world became larger. The river became larger. Time became larger. Other people's lives became larger. And you became smaller. Not less important. Simply smaller. The moon reflected on the water. The reeds moved gently in the wind. Far behind him, the village slept. The boy sat there until his eyes grew heavy. Then he stood. He walked slowly home. The path was familiar. The stars followed overhead. Inside the house, everyone was asleep. He lay down on his woven mat. The room was warm. The night was quiet. The river continued its endless journey through the darkness. And as sleep slowly arrived, the boy realized that perhaps becoming an adult did not mean learning how to become strong. Perhaps it meant learning how to be small, and finding peace in that knowledge. The boy slept deeply that night. The conversation beside the river remained somewhere in his thoughts, drifting through his dreams like a small boat carried by the current. He dreamed of the Nile stretching farther than he could see. He dreamed of walking along its banks for many years, watching seasons change, watching people grow older, watching himself become someone he did not yet recognize. When he woke, the dream had already begun to fade. Only the feeling remained. A feeling of distance. A feeling of time moving quietly around him. The house was still dark. The familiar sounds had already begun. His mother was awake. The grinding stone turned slowly. Stone against stone. The sound filled the room. His father sat near the doorway, waiting for the first light of morning. The boy remained where he was for a few moments. He listened. The breathing of his younger siblings. The soft scrape of grain. The faint sound of the river beyond the village. These sounds had always existed. He had simply never paid such close attention to them before. Perhaps growing older meant learning how to listen. Eventually, he stood. The earth floor felt cool beneath his feet. Outside, the sky remained dark blue. The stars had not yet disappeared. The village was only beginning to wake. A few lamps still burned behind doorways. Smoke rose from the earliest cooking fires. A donkey shifted in its sleep. The air smelled of dust, water, and ash. The boy walked slowly toward the edge of the village. He did not intend to go anywhere in particular. He simply wanted to walk. The ground beneath his sandals felt familiar. He had walked these paths thousands of times. And yet, this morning, they seemed different. Or perhaps he was different. He passed the house of the old woman who wove baskets. She was already awake. Even before sunrise. She sat beside her doorway, working by the light of a small oil lamp. Her hands moved slowly. Patiently. She did not look up. The boy wondered how many mornings she had spent exactly this way. He continued walking. Soon, he reached the river. The Nile was calm. Mist hovered above the water. The opposite shore appeared distant and uncertain in the early light. He sat down. The earth was cool. The reeds moved softly in the breeze. He thought about the old fisherman. He thought about his father. He thought about the older workers resting in the shade, speaking quietly about how strong they had once been. He tried to imagine himself becoming old. He could not. He could imagine tomorrow. He could imagine next season. Perhaps even next year. But old age seemed to belong to another world. And yet, every old person had once been exactly where he was now. The thought returned again and again. The sky slowly brightened. The stars faded. Birds began calling from the reeds. The day approached. He heard footsteps behind him. He did not turn immediately. He already knew who it was. His father sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. They watched the river. Finally, his father asked quietly, "What are you thinking about?" The boy hesitated. Then he answered truthfully. "Growing older." His father smiled. Not because the answer was amusing. Because he understood. "I thought about that a lot when I was your age," he said. The boy looked at him. "What did you think?" His father was silent for a long time. The river moved. A bird crossed the sky. The morning light grew stronger. "I thought becoming older would mean understanding everything." The boy waited. His father laughed softly. "It doesn't." The words hung in the air. The boy felt strangely relieved. He had believed that adults possessed some hidden knowledge, some secret understanding that children lacked. But perhaps they did not. Perhaps they simply learned to live with uncertainty. The sun finally appeared above the horizon. Its light spread across the river. The water turned gold. The village behind them began to fill with sound. Another day had arrived. His father stood. "There is work," he said. Of course there was. There was always work. The boy stood too. Together, they walked back toward the village. The morning air remained cool for now. Women carried water jars. Farmers gathered tools. Children still young enough to remain children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Life began again. That day, they worked near the grain storehouses. The harvest season was still some time away, but repairs never ended. Wooden beams had to be replaced. Mud brick walls needed reinforcement. Storage jars required cleaning. The work was not difficult. But there was a great deal of it. The boy carried tools. He mixed mud. He swept debris. The hours passed. The sun climbed. The heat returned. As he worked, he watched the older men around him. One limped slightly. Another paused often to rest his back. A third worked slowly but never stopped. He realized something. No one escaped labor. Not the young. Not the old. Not the strong. Not the weak. The work simply changed. A child carried small baskets. A young man carried heavy ones. An old man carried knowledge. Everyone carried something. This thought stayed with him through the morning. When midday finally arrived and the workers rested in the shade, the boy sat quietly beside the storehouse wall. He closed his eyes. The warmth of the earth pressed against his back. He listened to the sounds around him. The wind. The insects. The distant Nile. The breathing of tired workers. And somewhere within those sounds, he felt another lesson settling gently into place. Growing up did not mean becoming larger than the world. It meant discovering how many things were larger than you. The river. The sky. Time. Work. Family. Memory. And perhaps learning to be small was not a failure. Perhaps it was simply part of being human in the ancient world, beneath the endless sun and beside the patient waters of the Nile. The shade beside the grain storehouse was thin. It provided enough shelter to soften the sunlight, but not enough to remove the heat that had settled over the village by midday. The walls of the storehouse itself held warmth from countless previous days. Even the air seemed tired. The boy sat with his back against the mud brick wall. Around him, the other workers rested in their own ways. One man lay flat on the ground with his arm covering his eyes. Another slowly drank water from a clay cup. A third simply sat and stared toward the river, as though he had forgotten everything except the need to remain still. No one spoke much. Words, like strength, were saved whenever possible. The boy closed his eyes. He could feel the morning's labor in every part of his body. His hands felt heavy. His shoulders ached. Even his breathing seemed slower. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A kind of familiarity. He was becoming accustomed to being tired. This realization surprised him. Not because he disliked it. Because he had not noticed when it had happened. When he was younger, tiredness had always felt temporary. A long walk. A day of play. An afternoon spent helping with chores. Then rest. Then recovery. But now tiredness seemed different. It lingered. It waited. It followed him from one day into the next. Perhaps this was another part of becoming older. Not escaping exhaustion. Learning how to carry it. A fly landed on his arm. He brushed it away. Nearby, two older workers were speaking quietly. Their voices drifted through the warm air. "The flood was stronger when I was young," one of them said. The other nodded. "Everything seems stronger when we're young." They both fell silent. The boy thought about those words. He tried to remember what the world had felt like when he was smaller. Had the river seemed wider? Had the fields seemed larger? Had the adults seemed stronger? He could not remember clearly. Memory itself felt strange. Some days remained sharp. Others disappeared completely. Perhaps growing older also meant learning that even memories became tired. The rest ended gradually. As always, no one announced it. One worker stood. Then another. Then another. Soon, everyone was moving again. The boy stood carefully. His body protested. But only for a moment. Then the familiar rhythm returned. Lift. Carry. Walk. Return. The afternoon passed slowly. The sun moved across the sky. Dust settled on skin and clothing. The sound of work filled the village. Hammers against wood. Feet against earth. Voices calling quietly. The boy carried baskets of clay to workers repairing a section of the storehouse wall. The clay was heavy. After a time, he stopped noticing the weight. Not because it had become lighter. Because he had accepted it. As he worked, he noticed a man sitting near the entrance of the storehouse. The man was old. Older than almost anyone in the village. His hair was white. His hands trembled. He no longer worked. Instead, he watched. The boy had seen him many times before. He was a grandfather. A man who had spent decades working in the fields. Now, he sat in the shade and observed the world around him. The boy wondered what he saw. Did he remember being young? Did he remember carrying baskets beneath the sun? Did he remember believing that old age belonged to someone else? The old man noticed him looking. He smiled. The boy smiled back. Neither spoke. There was no need. The afternoon stretched onward. The shadows slowly lengthened. The heat softened. The sky changed color. At last, the work ended. The tools were put away. The walls were repaired. The baskets were empty. The day had been completed. Not conquered. Not defeated. Simply completed. The boy walked home beside his father. Their sandals stirred dust from the road. The village seemed quieter now. Children sat outside their homes. Women prepared evening meals. Smoke drifted upward into the fading light. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the boy asked a question. "Were you afraid of becoming older?" His father did not answer immediately. They continued walking. The sun hung low above the horizon. At last, he spoke. "No. The boy waited. "I was too busy." The answer surprised him. His father noticed. "When you're young," he continued quietly, "you think a lot about growing older." He looked toward the village. "Then one day, you wake up and realize it already happened." The boy felt the words settle inside him. Not heavily. Just quietly. Perhaps growing older did not happen in grand moments. Perhaps it happened while carrying water. While repairing roofs. While walking home. While watching the sun set over the Nile. They reached home. The evening meal was waiting. The oil lamp flickered. The younger children were already sleeping. The familiar sounds of home surrounded him. After eating, he stepped outside one final time. The sky was dark now. The stars had returned. The Nile reflected the moonlight. He sat beside the house. His body ached. His eyes felt heavy. Yet he remained awake for a little longer. He thought about the old fisherman. He thought about the old man at the storehouse. He thought about his father. Perhaps growing older did not mean becoming wiser. Perhaps it meant becoming more aware. Aware of time. Aware of effort. Aware of how much of life depended on ordinary people doing ordinary things every day. The night wind moved softly through the village. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The river continued its endless journey. The boy closed his eyes. Tomorrow would come. The sun would rise. The work would begin again. And somewhere within that endless repetition, another small lesson about becoming human in ancient Egypt would quietly reveal itself. The night deepened over the Nile Valley. The village had fallen silent. The cooking fires had faded into embers. The voices of neighbors had disappeared behind mud brick walls. The animals rested. The fields rested. Even the warm desert wind seemed to move more gently now. The boy lay awake for only a few moments longer. Around him, his family slept. He could hear the slow breathing of his father, who had carried so many days inside his body. He could hear the quiet breathing of his mother, who had worked from darkness to darkness. He could hear his younger siblings, who still belonged, for a little while longer, to the soft world of childhood. Outside, the Nile continued to flow. It had flowed before this village existed. It had flowed before his father was born. It would continue flowing long after every memory of this ordinary day had disappeared. And somehow, that thought no longer felt frightening. It felt peaceful. The boy understood now that growing older had never meant becoming large. It had never meant becoming powerful. It had never meant understanding everything. Growing older meant learning to live within a world that was already vast and ancient. It meant learning to carry small burdens with patience. It meant learning to accept tiredness without fear. It meant learning that ordinary days, repeated many times, slowly became a life. He thought of the fishermen on the river. The farmers in the fields. The builders beneath the sun. The mothers grinding grain before dawn. The old men resting in the shade. The children who would one day take their place. All of them lived beneath the same sky. All of them listened to the same river. All of them learned, in their own quiet way, how to be small in a very large world. The oil lamp burned lower. The stars continued their slow journey overhead. The warm earth released the last of the day's heat. The boy closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again. The river would flow again. The work would begin again. But tonight, there was only stillness. Only the sound of water moving through the darkness. Only the soft wind crossing the Nile. Only the ancient and gentle feeling of being one small life among countless others. And as the village slept beneath the endless Egyptian sky, and the river carried its quiet song into the night, the world grew softer, and softer still. Until there was nothing left to do. Nothing left to carry. Nothing left to understand. Only rest. And the peaceful sound of the Nile flowing forever through the dark.